Ronald and Nancy Reagan set the tone for American consumers in 1981 with their extravagant parties and excessive spending within the White House. This spending was under scrutiny by a majority of America, considering the recent economic recession. With the expanding market of goods and services, Americans were exposed to a new culture that relied on materialism. Aside from the Reagans, influential figures from the time period were also creating a sense of extravagance through media representation. Artists like Madonna and characters like Gordon Gekko insinuated that free market capitalism was always the answer. Supply-side economists touted free markets as a panacea for the United States' economic problems and insisted that allowing American businessmen to pursue their own self-interests would lead their profits to trickle down, creating widespread prosperity. The American people were won over, consumption became popular, and soon the small is beautiful philosophy of the 1970s was cast aside in favor of blatant consumerism. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, the American middle class was consuming more than any previous generation had, and their consumption was increasingly upscale. The American dream was changing, moving from a little suburban house with a white picket fence, 2 cars, and an annual vacation, to big houses, second homes, and luxury cars. Personal computers, private schools and universities, designer clothes, kitchen appliances, air conditioning, and a myriad of other products entered the American middle-class lifestyle, apparently there to stay. Americans were going on more vacations, and spending on recreation more than doubled. At a minimum, the average person's spending increased 30% between 1979 and 1995. At a minimum, calculated by taking into account a possible bias in the Consumer Price Index, the increase is more than twice that, or about 70%. Shopping was in vogue, and Americans in the 1980s could find no reason not to spend. With everything seemingly on sale and inflation and interest rates falling, why not buy? American consumption exploded. In a 5-year period at mid-decade, the 91 million U.S. households purchased 62 million microwave ovens, 63 million VCRs, 57 million washers and dryers, 88 million cars and light trucks, 105 million color television sets, 31 million cordless phones, and 30 million telephone answering machines. Americans engaged in the greatest spending spree since the boom that followed World War II, causing journalist Tom Wolfe to refer to Americans in the 1980s as the splurge generation. Shopping malls entered suburbia and flourished, with surveys showing in the 1980s that most Americans could easily travel to at least 2 shopping malls, often more. More restaurants, arcades, and special events began to appear in American shopping centers, making them prime places to spend day after day. As the Cold War began to escalate, Americans terrified of nuclear war and a bolt from the blue also turned to shopping malls for a sense of security and a means of psychological escape. No matter the reason, Americans were spending an unprecedented amount of time in malls in the 1980s. Even those who did not frequent malls were no beyond the reach of consumerism. A growing number of telemarketing operations and mail-order outlets competed with traditional staples like Sears, Montgomery Ward, and L.L. Bean to ensure that no American could escape a lifestyle defined by consumption.
What the baby boomers will buy next, a 1984 article in Fortune noted. With the oldest boomers now approaching 40 and the youngest just leaving college, the generation is entering its prime years of earning and spending. The boomers are a mouth-watering market because they're maturing into the most affluent generation the U.S. has ever seen. Not only will they be rich, but the boomers will also spend a greater proportion of their wealth than any previous generation. It all adds up to the hugest consumer market ever. The article also observed that in 1983, households headed by people aged 25 to 34, the center of the baby boom, had a median income of $21,746, already higher than the national median for all age groups. It projected that by 1995, that same group would be making more than $50,000 in constant 1982 dollars. Marketers devoted their time and resources to studying the baby boomers. By its sheer size of about 70 million, the baby boom generation decisively impacted every decade it passed through, and the businessman with some insight into what the baby boomers' needs would be and what buying habits to expect would have a huge leg up over his opponents. In the 1980s, marketers trying to define the markets and attract the biggest chunks of discretionary spending, or disposable income, chased other demographic groups in addition to the baby boomers. Realizing that senior Americans were relatively better off than previous generations of the elderly, marketers began exploring the newly identified gray market. In the 1980s, the United States seemed to be booming. Workers were bringing in unprecedented incomes. More was being bought and sold than ever before. But among rising instances of compulsive shopping and other negative impacts of consumerism on the American people came reports that the economic success of the 1980s was not what it seemed. Fiscal policies had been put in place that transformed the United States from the largest creditor nation in 1980 to the largest debtor in the world by 1986. The United States was booming, but sprinting towards an economic crisis. In his Day of Reckoning, The Consequences of American Economic Policy Under Reagan and After, of 1988, Benjamin Friedman wrote, "It is clear that this sense of economic well-being was an illusion based on borrowed time and borrowed money. Jobs are plentiful and profits are high because we are spending amply, but more than ever what we are spending for is consumption. We are living well by running up our debt and selling off our assets. America has thrown itself a party and billed the tab to the future.